So a lot of folks have accused the steel industry of being protectionist, but then we see folks like Nucor and other steel mills going ahead and being part of these free trade agreement talks. Which is it? Why are they here? What is their capacity to be part of these talks, and what are they trying to get out of it?
Well, Nucor is here because this is going to be an important free trade agreement. The Trans-Pacific Partnership would put 9 countries together, and if the negotiations are successful, it would be the biggest free trade agreement that's been done since the North America Free Trade Agreement. So it's very important for steel companies, and it's important for Nucor. Nucor is increasing its exports of products. It's a global player now, not just a U.S. player or a North American player. And so they want to be sure that they have an opportunity to get into those markets overseas. They have a lot riding on the Colombia and Panama free trade agreements as well. But there would be even more on the TPP, which is expected to be sort of the gold standard free trade agreement going forward.
So are these steel companies at the table at negotiations like the TPP? Are they at the table offensively or defensively? Are they trying to make sure certain things are in the agreements? From your standpoint, how do you see that?
Sure. Well, they're definitely trying to make sure that U.S. negotiators are putting certain things in the agreements. Some of them are defensive in nature, and that has to do primarily with the fact that these companies are competing more with state-owned companies and state-owned enterprises. And so it's competition with government-sponsored entities, entities that receive subsidies, that receive preferential treatment, that receive maybe regulatory help, low-interest loans, things like that. So the problem is Nucor and the steel industry can compete with anybody on a fair basis, on a level playing field, but it's difficult to compete against governments, not just companies. So what Nucor is trying to do is to make sure that as we open our markets, that everyone else is doing the same thing, and that these free trade agreements, like the TPP, are negotiated on a fair basis so that it's companies competing with each other, no one getting a leg up from government.
Right. Now, we talked a bit before about export restrictions. Can you talk a little bit about how that factors into not only what you're going to present, but how, from an implication standpoint, what the government is looking to get out of that, and the steel industry, really?
Sure. Well, since free trade agreements would take regular tariffs down to 0 among all the countries, the challenge is what other kinds of barriers are out there. And one of the things that Nucor has been working on has been restrictions on trade in raw materials, things like iron ore and scrap and coke, all of which are essential to the steel and the manufacturing industries. And the problem is that many countries have imposed barriers to trade on these products, on these raw materials, and it can take a lot of different forms. Some countries put quotas in place and will only let a certain amount out every year. Some countries impose absolute bans, and a growing number of countries impose export taxes. So it's just a 10%, 20% tax on the raw material when it goes out. And of course, that does tilt the playing field. It tends to decrease prices for the country that imposes the tax. It increases prices on anyone else around the world, and it also makes those raw materials harder to get. So we think an important part of any free trade agreement is the elimination of all export taxes among all the countries.
Gotcha. Now, in terms of the relationship between the U.S. and China, which is a very, obviously, huge trading partner that is not involved in the TPP negotiations,
right.
How do you see the trade relationship there changing or not changing based on what happens in this negotiations process?
Well, it's true that China is not a party to the TPP talks, but most of the countries involved are players in the Asia-Pacific region. And so it's important to set the rules of the road with these countries so that when future free trade agreements or trade negotiations go on with China, there'll be precedent for what we want those agreements to look like. So on provisions like export restrictions, we want to eliminate them all. On state-owned enterprises, how they'll compete abroad, it would be good to get things right in the TPP and then carry that forward to China, whether that's at the WTO, whether that's at the OECD or some other multilateral forum.
Do you think the pressure? Do you think there will be pressure on China beyond this? Do you think something really will change for the way that U.S. businesses have to deal with Chinese businesses and obviously the state-owned enterprises? How drastic will it be? In other words, I guess.
Well, we're hoping to increase pressure on China because it's not playing by the rules on a lot of these issues. And so you have to press on all fronts. And sometimes that means trade cases if there's unfair trade going on. Sometimes that means through trade negotiations, through bilateral talks with China. Just have to keep the pressure up on all fronts to make sure that it's as open a market as you can possibly get in a state-controlled economy like that.
Gotcha. Let's see what else I have here. Yeah, about that, you did mention the Panama, Colombia, the FTA talks that are happening, I guess, in this hemisphere. Any other news or interesting issues on that point, on those dealings with those nations from your standpoint? Well,
we still have the 3 free trade agreements pending, and unfortunately Congress is still figuring out a way to address that issue. We're hopeful that those will all come up for votes by Congress in the fall, that those will be approved, and that will take tariffs to 0 between the United States and all 3 of those countries. Korea is a very big trading partner that would affect large levels of trade, and as I mentioned, Nucor is looking to export steel increasingly into the Caribbean, South American regions. So that is those are very important markets for them.
Gotcha.
So I should probably add one other point on state-owned enterprises.
Yes.
Just to emphasize that the key issue is that state-owned enterprises make up a large amount of trade with these TPP countries and with China. So the companies are not completely privately owned and run. The government has a say in business decisions that are made. And there are things like preferential loans, interest-free loans, outright grants, regulatory differences, things like that. And it's bad enough when that happens with a state-owned enterprise within its own country, but increasingly those state-owned enterprises are looking outward. They're setting up shop in other countries, even in the United States. There are a couple of examples of foreign companies that are state-owned enterprises setting up in the United States to compete against companies like Nucor. So what we're asking for in the TPP talks is that any investment in another TPP party or any operations of a company within a TPP country have to be done solely on a commercial basis. So it applies both to the initial investment into the country, that has to be on a commercial basis, or the operations. So you can't set up a company and then funnel grants and subsidies and loans to it once it's operating. So that's going to be a really important thing to look for. We want to see what the U.S. negotiators put forward and to make sure that they address that point in these talks.